Hitting the go live. You're live.
Welcome to Community Office Hours. We're here with Waypoint today. We've been doing KubeCon theme stuff all week, so anything Kubernetes related, and I suppose by extension CNCF ecosystem related as well. So we're excited for that. Today, you're welcome to interact in chat. We always appreciate you having the opportunity to ask questions, etc. But do keep in mind, please be professional, please be welcoming, please adhere to code of conduct as you do. With that, I'm here with Izaak today. Izaak, would you care to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Izaak Lauer. I am a member of the core Waypoint team. I've been with HashiCorp for about 4 months now, maybe 5 months. So really feel like I'm hitting my stride in core Waypoint. I come with some Kubernetes experience too. So. Oh, are you muted, Rosemary?
Yes. All right, here we go.
No worries.
Thank you. So I have Kubernetes experience, but I'm not as familiar with Waypoint. So can you give me a very rapid summary of what is Waypoint and what is it trying to solve?
Sure. So this is something I've been thinking about. There are lots of different things that Waypoint does for you, and it's easy sometimes to get bogged down and it does all of these individual things. The way I've been thinking about Waypoint is that it's a holistic, it contains a holistic vision of your application. So like your app isn't just the source code that makes it up. It's also like the build process and the tools that you use to build it. And it's a number of instances that are running, maybe some instances in dev, some instances in production. It's a load balancer, and it's all of the glue that has to go between all of those things to actually make it work. And you can manage your application without an overall vision. You can have a naming convention and access to a bunch of different tools that do the individual things. But what Waypoint does is it draws a higher level abstraction over all of that. It knows about your application from source control all the way out to the endpoint it has running in production. And that gives you a bunch of benefits. Like one is that developers get one touch point for dealing with their whole app. We have a UI, and they can see how their application follows from source control through build, through release, through multiple environments. It also has it manages a lot of the glue between those services too. So you don't have to spend as much time writing bash scripts and Jenkins jobs or whatever it is that you would do to glue them together if you use Waypoint. That's just a really high level introduction of what it does.
I mean, I will acknowledge I do love a good make file, but it sometimes doesn't accomplish what I need. And I'm going to be honest, it's probably not exactly secure either. Mm-hmm. You probably have some interesting workflows in there that I'm not supposed to have. But what you're describing is a little bit kind of like, I guess, Helm, right? Not that Helm handles the end-to-end workflow necessarily, but there is this component of bundling all of the things that you possibly might need for your application deployment to production. How does Waypoint differ from Helm? Is it the same? Does it use Helm? Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Waypoint is a tool that can be used on top of Helm. If you think about other services that provide a holistic app vision, like Heroku is one of them. You can push your code to a Git repository, and Heroku will do the rest, and it will walk your application through the entire flow to production. Waypoint does that too, but it does it with whatever infrastructure and tools you're already using to do those individual pieces, and it's open source. So if you're already using Helm to manage the deployments of your application, Waypoint has a Helm plugin, and you can slot your Helm charts and templates into Waypoint, and Waypoint will use Helm to run the deployment, but it will also link it to the build that it does. So it will deploy the artifact that you've created, and it will handle the multiple environment management for you.
That's really interesting. I think that's one of the things that I didn't necessarily enjoy so much about Helm. I mean, unless you went to your values file and you accounted for different kinds of environments, accounted for all of those configuration changes, then you have, there's even Helm files, there are more abstractions on top of that even to help template out your Helm values file and to template out your Helm chart. It gets a little bit much. So what I'm interested in particular is that how exactly does Waypoint sort of handle all of the Helm constructs? For example, pre-hooks, post-hooks, all of these things that happen that people tend to use in Helm to check for status, check for different, I guess, different parts of their application and what's going on with it.
That's a great question. And actually, I am not an expert at Helm in particular. I have deep Kubernetes experience, but not Helm specifically. So as far as pre-hooks and post-hooks go, I don't know that I'll be able to answer.
Yeah.
But I do have a demo of the Helm plugin coming up, and I can show you then how Waypoint directly links into the Helm charts and how Waypoint variables turn into Helm templated values.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd love to check it out. It might help give a better understanding of these multiple environments, how Waypoint 0.6, which I believe we announced,
Yes.
Waypoint 0.6.
At least yesterday.
Yeah, yesterday. You're getting everybody here is listening to like the latest and greatest feature. So it would be interesting to see a little bit more about what that looks like, and then maybe we can talk more about Waypoint 0.6 and environments and how it handles it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. If you have a demo.
All right.
Let's see.
I do have a demo. I'm going to share my screen. We'll see if that works first. Victory. All right. So one of the new features in Waypoint 0.6 is a plugin to allow deployments to Helm. But it is not, I just like to call out, it is not the only way that that Waypoint can interact with Kubernetes. We actually have a number of plugins that sort of span the level of direct interaction that you want with Kubernetes. At the highest level, we have a native Kubernetes plugin that takes a really opinionated approach for how to work with Kubernetes. It's YAML-less, and we have this Waypoint examples repo that shows examples of how to use all different kinds of plugins. Looking at it at a high level, we have plugins for lots of platforms, and I recommend looking at these. But if we're going into Kubernetes, let's just take a look at the regular Kubernetes plugin. The waypoint.hcl file is the file that you use to configure how your app interacts with Waypoint. And if you want to deploy with Kubernetes using the Kubernetes plugin, it's as easy as this. You have a deploy stanza, you say use Kubernetes, and Waypoint has an opinionated flow for how your application is deployed to Kubernetes. At the other extreme end, we have a kubectl apply plugin, where if you are a Kubernetes master and have a bunch of and have all of your own YAML manifests, Waypoint can take those and use it to deploy your app. So here's an example of a fully baked Kubernetes deployment manifest, and you can use that too. But we're not talking about either of those. We're talking about somewhere in the middle, which is the Helm plugin. So you would use this if you're already using Helm. Let's say your application already has a Helm chart written and you'd like to use Waypoint in addition to it. This will work great. This is also really helpful if you have, say, Kubernetes custom resources that your app needs to integrate with. You can specify those as part of your Helm chart. And what I'm going to show today is just really just walk you through this example of a Node.js app being deployed with Helm. So I have it over here. I have it running on a branch. And let's start by just looking at the app. It's very basic. It's a basic Node.js app. Let's just cat this. Nothing special about the app. Serves on a port, serves some basic UI. Let's also just take a quick look at Helm. We have a Helm chart. This is already written. This doesn't have to live in the same repo as the app. This can live in your organization's Helm repository or somewhere else. But we have a template. And there are really only two resources that go with this app. There's a deployment YAML, which is templated the way you would expect. The important values here to look at are the image and the tag that we're deploying in particular. And then we also have a service, which is a basic load balancer type service. Let's jump up a level and look at our values. These are the values that we can slot into the chart. There's an image pull policy and pull secrets. These we're configuring with these values with Helm. But then there's also a repository and tag, and these are values that Waypoint knows the answer to. Waypoint is what performs your builds, so it is what we'll use to slot in the values for these at deploy time. So how do we do that? Let's look at the Waypoint.hcl and see. So this is almost exactly the same as what is in GitHub. The only changes that I've made are I have a special name for the project. The way that you represent an app in Waypoint is you have a number of stanzas. You have a build stanza that tells Waypoint how to build your app. This is one of the simplest ways to do it. Just say use pack, and pack can figure out how your app needs to be built. I also have it pointing to an ECR registry using just a registry that I already have configured. And then we're deploying with Helm. So again, this chart happens to live in this repo, but it doesn't need to. It could just as easily live somewhere else. This is an interesting bit of glue here. One of the cool features about Waypoint is it has a custom entry point that enables features that work on any platform. So if you use the Waypoint custom entry point, when your app comes up, the entry point will connect back to the Waypoint server, and it will do things like ask the Waypoint server for config values, and then it will put those config values into the environment so that your app has them available. And it will also do cool things like restart your application process if the config changes. That's one of the features, but it needs to know how to connect to the Waypoint server. It needs some environment variables. And in the opinionated plugin, we can set those automatically. With Helm, we need a little bit of extra glue. So what this does is it templates out a values file using this HCL template file function with some particular Waypoint values. And we can look at this in a second. The other thing we're doing is just setting Helm variables. We're setting the name image.repository to this value. This value is a Waypoint variable called artifact.image. Waypoint has a bunch of variables. You can look at our documentation to find the full list, but these are available for you to use at different points in your app's lifecycle. And then we're also setting the tag to the artifact tag. And again, these are the values that Waypoint knows because it performs the build. It comes out of this build phase.
I will say I did a double take when I saw the directives in there. I was like, this looks a lot like the Terraform provider. I was like, even the values file, template file syntax, right? Because we had a KubeCon deep dive for Terraform a couple days ago. And literally very much the same kind of approach. So I'm like, oh, this is very familiar. I like this.
Yeah, this has been one of my favorite things about working on Waypoint, honestly, is that it has learned so many lessons from the HashiCorp products that have come before it, so much from Terraform and from Vault and from Console, not only about what the best way is to configure apps and what the best way is to expose this kind of complexity to developers, but also just like internal details of like, how do you build a project with a plugin architecture that is going to be robust, but also like cede a lot of control to the plugins. I feel like there's a lot of not only this, but a lot of other like latent potential inside Waypoint that is going to become more clear as Waypoint becomes more feature rich over time.
Yeah, it was just so funny. I was like, wow, that looks a lot like the Terraform that I had written a couple of days ago. Well, the other thing that I do like, and I appreciate this, is that, I was using Spinnaker for a few things. And it was, when you use the Spinnaker Kubernetes plugin or driver, it's very, 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 very opinionated. And there's not too much there's not too much flexibility to it in the way that you have a very specific repository definition and a very specific image definition for your artifact, right? And then you have to figure out a million ways to chain these commands together, passing the artifact that you built to a very opinionated Kubernetes definition. And here I'm like, oh, well, I don't necessarily need to be too opinionated. I have something that maybe I've already standardized on, like a Helm chart. and I just pass in whatever, it seems like whatever parameters that I could want to override in the values. And that seems to be an easier workflow for someone who might be coming from Helm and going to Waypoint or any of the other, or Kubernetes even to Waypoint.
Yeah, no, definitely. I really like that Waypoint sort of meets people where they are. There's something to be said for sure for having an opinionated workflow. Like lots of, if you don't have strong opinions yourself, it's really nice if somebody just comes in and says like, well, here are some good opinions, run with it. And for that, we have the native Kubernetes plugin. But if you do have some opinions, or if you come up with some over time, Waypoint can grow with you.
Awesome.
So,
sorry, I interrupted.
No, that was great. We can talk about Spinnaker more too later. I've done lots of work with Spinnaker. So here's the last piece of secret glue. This is just a template file that uses everything in Waypoint's entry point.env variable and turns it into a Helm values file, basically. And the last thing I'll show you is that there is nothing up my sleeves. I have a Kubernetes cluster, and it is just a basic 2-node, 2-worker node EKS cluster. Let's hope I cleaned up properly before I did. Hey, I also have 2 pods in here. I have the Waypoint server and the Waypoint runner. And these are things that we can talk about more maybe after this demo. There are some interesting changes to the way Waypoint manages runners in this release, but I am now going to use Waypoint to deploy this application. So first thing I do is type Waypoint init. This tells Waypoint about this project and validates all my config. And then you can manage sort of each lifecycle stage of your app independently. You can build it, deploy it, and release it independently. But we also have an all-in-one command, Waypoint up, to just send it all the way, assuming everything works. So I'm running that now. And it's going to use pack to build my app. The build might take a minute. It seems like the Node.js downloads have been slow recently, so it might take a little longer than normal. But
that's fine. You don't want to fill time. It's scanning it. I mean, it's not so bad. Look at that.
Oh, there we go. Look at how fast that was. That was great.
Look,
probably because I ran it
ingesting the
once
entry
to cached everything.
Yeah, exactly. So are you using EKS for this? Out of curiosity? Okay.
Yep.
Great.
This is an EKS cluster. EKS isn't required. You can do it with any Kubernetes cluster, including the, I've been a big fan actually recently of the local one that comes with Docker for testing.
It's really convenient. It's so convenient. You get a lot out of it. I mean, the only thing that's it breaks down a little bit is when you have like storage or other CRDs that do something, but for the most part, it does, it does what it needs.
So here we go. It succeeded. So first, let's just verify that it's there in Helm. Voila. We have the example Node.js app deployed in Helm. Let's also look inside Kubernetes. And there it is. We have our pod up and running. And then one of the interesting things that Waypoint gives you through that entry point is it gives you a URL specific to your deployment that doesn't use a Kubernetes service or any other Kubernetes infrastructure. So if you're trying to like debug networking problems, this is a really great tool to isolate it, or just trying to understand exactly what's happening in a particular deployment. So let's go to this specific URL that it gave us. And here it is, our app on the internet.
It's amazing.
That's it. And then the last thing we can look at maybe is just describe this pod. Actually, you know what we'll do? We'll get it as YAML. And this will let us really dig in and see what happened. So here are some of the environment variables that Waypoint gave. It injected an address and a token for my Waypoint server.
Out of curiosity, Is that token supposed to be secret?
It's not top secret. I'll rotate the Waypoint server after this. It's okay.
Oh, okay. All right. It's interesting. I would expect it. Is it usually an environment variable? Maybe I'm just not as familiar with it, but is it usually an environment variable?
Yeah, this is how Waypoint injects the configuration that the entry point needs to talk to the Waypoint server. It's through environment variables.
Awesome. Good to know.
And that's the demo.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really cool. I think that it just seems so easy. I feel like I'm missing something.
That's one thing we're trying to do is make the experience as seamless as possible. But if you take your Helm chart and compare it to the example and try to use Waypoint, hopefully the experience will be similarly easy.
Okay, awesome. And one of the things that I did raise earlier, but maybe it's something that's different. Is there something that I can in Waypoint that I can do after the deploy, right? For example, if I wanted to send a Slack notification, et cetera. So if, let's say, the Helm chart finishes or the status is done, is there something that I can add to Waypoint that allows me to do something like a post event? So maybe I don't need to do that in my make file after I do a Helm install or something.
No, that's a great question, and that's actually something that that people have been asking about. We do have a hooks feature where you can hook into various operations, and I know that we're planning on making that more robust in the future. So I would say watch that space.
Cool. All right. So this is just one thing that was in Waypoint 0.6. There were a lot more. And what are some of your favorite features or workflows that have been included?
Oh yeah. So there were a couple focuses for this release. One of the big focuses was making the Kubernetes workflow in particular as solid as possible. Waypoint has lots of different plugins, supports lots of different infrastructure, but we wanted to really make sure that the Kubernetes workflow in particular was a first-class experience. So some of that has been supporting some of the slightly more esoteric Kubernetes features. For example, we have sidecar support in this release. If you'd like to run a metric sidecar or an Ingress proxy sidecar, that's something that you can do now using the Kubernetes plugin. We also have support for auto scaling. We have support for the new Ingress resource. And we also have just sort of a lot of general polish on the workflow of getting a new app into production. So like one example of that is when you're deploying your app, we will detect some common failure modes, like for example, image pull back off, and we will warn you right away as soon as we detect it as you're deploying, saying like, oh, hey, it looks like this application isn't going to come online, probably because this image that you've specified doesn't match. And that's something that we've been thinking about a lot, is how to reduce the amount of secret Kubernetes knowledge that you need to debug an application.
Oh yeah, secret Kubernetes knowledge. It's very tricky. I spent, I think, 3 days trying to figure out metrics in Kubernetes for this past week. So the pain is real.
Yep.
But I am curious about the Ingress, because Waypoint comes up and there is that test endpoint, which was, I think, in your demo, early divine deer or something. So tell me a little bit how the Ingress resource works.
Oh yeah, so there are lots of ways to get Ingress to your app. That's one of the easiest ways, is to use the waypoint.run URLs that you get for free. But if you want really solid production Ingress, you have more options. The way we manage Ingress in Waypoint is through the release stanza. So one of the easiest ways to release your app on Kubernetes is just to use a node port service or a cluster IP type service. You can also use a load balancer type service, which will plug into whatever load balancer your cluster has configured. So for the example that I made, it was an ALB. But if your organization uses Kubernetes Ingress through the Nginx Ingress controller, or traffic, I never know how to pronounce it. But if you use Ingress, we now have a release stanza that supports that Ingress resource. So you can put in the details of the route that you'd like, and Waypoint will make sure that Ingress is configured for your app.
Interesting.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah. And so you could pass something like paths, for example, like the different paths and the different routing that you potentially would need. Okay, interesting.
Exactly.
Wow, well, that's convenient.
Mhm.
And I know that Waypoint, I know you mentioned this before about handling and helping with multiple environments. Can you explain a little bit about the kinds of workflows that that Waypoint will be able to help with to support multiple environments?
Oh yeah, that's been another focus for this release. So one of the biggest pieces of feedback that we've gotten, and also trying to use Waypoint for our own projects, is that it would be nice if Waypoint helped more with managing multiple environments. Like I said earlier, Waypoint sort of tries to have a holistic view of your application. Lots of applications have more than one environment. They'll have say one set of config for dev, one set of config for prod, maybe multiple sets of instances running between dev and prod, maybe even more than 2 environments, maybe dev staging and prod. And in this release, Waypoint has really solidified its workspaces feature. So workspaces have existed before, but now you can really start to use them to configure your application for multiple environments. One example is config. You can now specify a different set of application config for a dev workspace than a prod workspace, and Waypoint will deliver that to the different instance groups that you have in those 2 workspaces.
Nice. And is it possible to say like, hey, maybe I have a predefined image for, I don't know, for development and testing, right? For a testing environment, but I don't have it for production. So is there a way that I could split or change the build, deploy, release steps in the Waypoint files, for example?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting question. So one thing we're thinking about now is how to manage those images as they roll between the different environments. The current setup is that Waypoint will build separate images basically for each workspace. And the one thing we're thinking about for the future is a first-class vision of how to promote different artifacts and images up through the different environments. And that might include just using the same image that you have in dev, or it could be something more sophisticated. So to answer your question today, I think that it is possible using input variables. I think that you could use a different image for a different workspace, but it's something that we're definitely thinking about for the future too, is how to make that promotion workflow work.
Interesting. Yeah, because I know that there's a lot of focus on, there's a lot of questions in general, right? Like about building images and promoting those artifacts across environments and across your delivery pipeline, for lack of a better word. And it's certainly something that we all try to figure out, is it better or worse to push different and rebuild an image every time, or it's better to do that promotion? So it's something that I was like, oh, if we have multiple environments now, is there a way that I could separate that out? There is a note about Kubernetes auto-scaling deployments, and that sounds really intriguing to me, but I'm not really sure what exactly that involves. I know Kubernetes has horizontal pod autoscaler, horizontal vertical autoscaling, and the node groups themselves, you can set autoscaling depending on your platform. But what is the Kubernetes autoscaling deployments feature exactly?
This is something that it seems like the industry is really interested in, is how to do auto scaling. And it's kind of a tough problem. Like if you do auto scaling right, you can save a lot of cost. you can have your application right sized for whatever particular time and amount of load that you have, and you don't have to think about like pre-scaling it for big events or for different times of day. But it can also be tricky because you have to understand exactly what metrics your application scales on, and it's also just tricky to configure. With Kubernetes in particular, there there are separate resources like the horizontal pod autoscaler that you have to set up to make it work. So what we've focused on for this release is making that configuration stage of autoscaling easy and simple. So you can specify a CPU threshold for your app to scale on. And if you have the metric server set up in your cluster, it takes it makes some opinionated config settings, and it will make CPU autoscaling work for your app. And that is often enough for many apps to really benefit from autoscaling. But it's also something that we're definitely still thinking about, is how to get more visibility into autoscaling.
Got it. So the metric server you would deploy yourself, right? You wouldn't, there's nothing out of the box necessarily from Waypoint. I would have to find one. I assume there's, depending on my application, et cetera.
Yes, that's true. Yep. Waypoint does not run a metric server for you as of today.
Okay. So it's is there something that's not compatible? Like if Waypoint is auto scaling on CPU, for example, is there a specific CPU metric that it's looking for? Can I set the CPU metric, or is there some kind of Kubernetes interface that it's looking for specifically?
You can set the CPU metric. I think you can also set memory as a threshold for scaling in addition to CPU. But those are the options today for auto scaling.
Awesome, cool. I also hear that Waypoint now has a Helm chart. So not only does it have a Helm plugin, it also has a Helm chart for itself. And a number of, Console Vault have Helm charts, for example. Why deploy Waypoint as a Helm chart? So isn't that kind of like, I feel like there's a chicken or egg problem where it's like, now you've got a Kubernetes cluster, you're going to deploy Waypoint on it so that you could deploy other stuff onto it. So why is there a Helm chart? Yep,
that bootstrap question is always interesting. How do you deploy the thing that deploys the things? Maybe to start thinking about the Helm chart, I'll say it's not much like the different plugins that we have for deploying apps on Kubernetes. There are multiple ways to run Waypoint on Kubernetes. Right now, there's a Waypoint server install command that just interacts with Kubernetes directly and installs the Waypoint server. It uses your local CLI to configure all the resources that Waypoint needs. And then also, if you're a sophisticated user, you can run Waypoint yourself. There's Waypoint is all sort of bundled in one static binary. There aren't that many components, and you can wrap the Waypoint server run command in a Kubernetes manifest, and you can roll from there. Helm is a nice. The one thing I like about the Helm chart is it's sort of a nice middle ground between those two. You can use Helm to, if you're already familiar with Helm especially, you can use Helm to deploy Waypoint into your cluster, but it also gives you some nice hooks to configure exactly how you'd like Waypoint to behave. And then also you have visibility into the manifest that it creates. And if you want to then make some more serious tweaks to say how Waypoint interacts with storage, or how Waypoint how the Waypoint server gets its ingress, you can do that. So that's sort of the background on the Helm chart. Why else would you want to use the Helm chart? One reason is if you want to manage Waypoint with something like Terraform, the Helm chart is a great way to do it. You can use the Terraform Helm provider to install Waypoint. And some of the things that we were thinking about in doing this, we wanted this to be a really good experience installing Waypoint with Helm, and we even had to make some core changes to make it work. One of the way you install Waypoint on Kubernetes today, your local CLI does some orchestration with, say, bootstrapping the Waypoint server, getting the initial token, and then saving it for you locally. And we made some core changes to Waypoint so that when you do the Helm install, it creates a small bootstrap job that does that initial work and then saves the initial token in a secret. And then there's a Waypoint login command that we made really specifically for the Helm chart that pulls that secret out of the Kubernetes cluster and makes it available to you to actually log into Waypoint and access your app.
Now, I'd be remiss in saying and not asking this. It's
Yeah.
okay if
Go
it's
ahead.
not there. But so we're talking a lot about Kubernetes this week, but we also have a number of people who are big fans of Nomad too. And first, to a certain degree, there are folks who run both.
Yep.
And there's a place for both, right? Both of them have their use cases. Nomad released 1.2 in beta, asterisk, in beta today, or yesterday, something like that. And they also, there's also a tech preview of Nomad Pack, which is a templating mechanism for Nomad job files. There is a Nomad plugin, I believe, for Waypoint as well. Do you think that there will be similar capability that as this Helm plugin for the upcoming Nomad Pack? I mean, it's still new, and you mentioned the Pack plugin. That is not the same Nomad Pack plugin we're talking about.
Oh, the names.
Very confusing. The names, there are lots of names. But do you think that this similar capability would be available for, let's say, any kind of templating mechanism for any kind of orchestrator?
It's not something that exists today, that in particular, but Nomad is definitely a platform that we've been thinking about. We know a lot of our existing users do run Nomad, and some of the features, even though the focus of this release has been on Kubernetes, there are some Nomad features in there too. One example is when you install the Waypoint server on Nomad, we now support, I forget the word, but it's Nomad persistent volumes, basic CSI. There we go, CSI volumes in Nomad. So instead of using ephemeral Nomad storage, you can now save Waypoint state in Nomad using a CSI volume. If you're running on AWS, that can be an EBS volume, but it can be whatever CSI plugin Nomad has configured. So we're definitely still thinking about the Nomad users, and specifically the install process of getting the Waypoint server and all the other components that go into Waypoint up and running on a Nomad cluster.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah, I know that was like out of left field, but it was just so interesting to me because I was like, oh yeah, Nomad also has some really interesting stuff coming out too. So and they're very, very close in workflow, right? In terms of the approach and for the communities themselves, how they would use them.
Yep. One of the other things I like about Waypoint is it doesn't force you to choose one sort of infrastructure provider, one runtime for your containers. You can use multiples. Waypoint is compatible, because Waypoint is compatible with Kubernetes and Nomad. You can actually have a Waypoint cluster that services deployments onto both of those.
Yeah, even ECS, AWS ECS, which like as much as we sometimes forget the other container orchestrators out there, AWS ECS is indeed there.
It's there.
All right. I think we're going to wrap up since we've gone through demo. There aren't any new questions in chat. So I have one last question. And I believe we mentioned this, or we alluded to this before, but this was from Taylor, who was supposed to be here today, but is not. What is your favorite way to spin up a Kubernetes cluster for testing?
Oh, so this is it depends. It depends on the job. I've been a big fan these days of the Kubernetes cluster that comes bundled with Docker, the like Docker dash desktop context. It works really well. And it's really convenient. It's super convenient how that the images that you have locally are available in that registry. You don't have to do as much monkeying around with registry config. So that's often the first thing that I'll lean on when I'm playing around with Kubernetes. I've also been working a lot with EKS recently, as you saw with this demo. EKS it's not always the fastest way in a Kubernetes cluster up, but it's very convenient and it works quite well. And then if I'm really playing around with some Kubernetes core pieces and I want to really understand what's happening, I'm not above spinning up 3 bare EC2 nodes and just using kubeadm to bootstrap myself a 3-node Kubernetes cluster. I've done that a couple times, and that's a good way to really get into it.
Yeah, I will have to acknowledge, like I am Minikube. I don't know why I'm very much like committed to Minikube. Maybe because that's the one I've been using for years for like development work and testing. And I was like, I really should try some of the others. I always go try the others, and I'm like, no, I like Minikube. Maybe it's the fact that I like VirtualBox as well. So
No,
those are the ones.
I like Minikube too. I think I worked at Target. I think Minikube was started at Target actually. Call out to Media, who I think is now the maintainer of Minikube. It's a great tool.
Yeah. Minikube or GKE, because I know Google Kubernetes Engine. The Google Kubernetes Engine is for when really have to have some capacity. And need a little bit more than what Minikube can offer locally, just because it's much faster for me to spin up. But there are always these options. But in terms of the various ones that I've used, I've started using DigitalOcean, and it's pretty nice. It is pretty nice. I do like it.
Mitchell is also a big fan of DigitalOcean, and in particular, I know that he uses Linode a fair amount too. So there are lots of different ways.
Everybody, there's a lot of Kubernetes clusters that you can create for testing. And you can choose your own adventure. I think it will be the great debate. People debate on IDEs. People will debate on the clusters for testing. All right. With that, is there anything else that we should consider, Izaak, as we explore Waypoint and Kubernetes and Helm?
Yeah, I feel like we just scratched the surface really with this Waypoint release. It's a really big one, and it enables a lot of new workflows. Another thing that we didn't touch on is remote workflows. That it lets you. There's really good support now for doing a GitOps flow and for having Git changes trigger different build, deploy, and release applications on your app, and much more. So check it out. It's a big release.
Yeah, I dropped a link into the chat. And if there's anything you would like to learn more about, let us know. Drop it on Discuss. Drop it in chat. We'd love to do another session on this. And in terms of upcoming events, we have HashiCorp Global next week. Stay tuned. You can sign up for register for the conference online. It is virtual, so you can just tune in. There will be a replay. So there's US and there's Asia Pacific, Japan replay as well. So I'll drop the link in chat. Izaak, will you be tuning into HashiCorp Global?
Will I? Yes. I'm actually giving a lightning demo on using Helm, the Helm chart to install Waypoint. So if you're more interested in Helm and Waypoint, check out that. And then also I know Evan is giving a great talk on getting an application from scratch up and running on Waypoint and walking through some of the common problems and debugging workflows that you might see there. So HashiCorp, it's going to be great.
Yeah. And it's also the last day of KubeCon, I think. If you would have last minute questions, would like to chat with folks, they're at the booth. We do have folks who are at KubeCon, and you can always drop in the CNCF Slack at 6 KubeCon HashiCorp, I think. So definitely check it out. If you have any other questions, you're welcome to reach out to us there. With that, thank you, Izaak, for coming and showing us all about Helm, Kubernetes, and Waypoint 0.6 and explaining a lot of interesting things. I feel like now I need to go explore more. And I also have to add some of the suggestions from chat about exploring Nomad into the list. So thank you all for interacting, and thank you all for joining. We will have you at the next